If you've got your Bibles, you might be turning to Genesis chapter 2. We'll be there in a few minutes. I've got some things to go through first, but that'll be the first passage to come to this morning. It's really good to be with you all this morning. It's a really good crowd, and several people visiting with us this morning. Just really appreciate being with you all this morning, seeing you all this morning. If you're visiting with us, you might not realize we've been working through a series on lessons that are centering on the topic of marriage. And our intention in this study has been that we're going to go through this topic while hearing from 3 different teachers. And I really appreciate the elders and Tim inviting me to be a part of this morning. Before we get too far into our lesson, though, I do have something I do need to get off my chest. When Tim asked me a while back if I'd be willing to put this lesson together, he told me about it was going to be a series with different men, and he was playing, well, Joey's going to preach first, and he's going to come from the young man's perspective. And, I went home and thought about that. It kind of hit me a little bit funny. So far in my life, usually when I've been a part of something like this, I've usually been that younger point of view. So I told Karen, I reflected on that. I was like, well, what did that happen? When did that happen? I noticed that he was out of the line of fire this morning. He moved to the side. When Tim announced it to the group, somehow I got upgraded to the middle age. That right there was just uncalled for. Joey said last week, he said he was an immature point of view. He wasn't. He did a good job. But he said he was the immature point of view. I thought that's what I was signing up for. So, I think they'll all agree with me if you were here last week that while Joey might be young, and I did the math, so you're 18, right, Joey? So he's less than half my age. So yeah, maybe I'm just not self-aware of where I am. While he's young, he did a really, really good job last week. Excellent job preparing and delivering our first lesson. I really appreciate him for that. And I told him last week I did something similar to him right before Karen and I got married. 2008. Actually, like a week before I got married, I preached a lesson that at the time felt a little bit awkward because I had no experience. And my intention with that was to put together a lesson before I had experience. I just wanted to go to what the Bible said. But I can assure you, Brother Joey, you are much more mature at your age than I was giving that lesson 17 years ago. This has been an interesting thing. Preaching, hearing from 3 different perspectives, because I know I'm not the same person as I was back when I was Joey's age, and I surely hope I'm not the same person I am, when I get older in my life as well. So this will be really interesting, and Brother Tim can clean up our mess next week. We also talked about how there's going to be a good bit of overlap between the 3 of us, and that's natural because we're all looking for the same resource for our teaching. But this morning, I will do my best to present the middle-aged when but hopefully it works out actually doing is presenting God's point of view. All right, no more knocking on this up. This past weekend, Karen and I, we celebrated our 17th wedding anniversary. And I realized I hadn't preached a lesson on marriage since our 14th anniversary, so it's been a bit. But I mentioned that to say naturally, this time of year, this subject is actually near and dear to my heart. It's no secret at all that man does not always do a good job in honoring God's design for marriage. It's not uncommon for mankind to joke about marriage, to treat it very casually. And some joke about marriage being like a prison. They feel trapped. They feel limited. Some view marriage as nothing more than this partnership that just makes sense economically. And we really shouldn't be surprised when those of the world don't honor God's institutions because they haven't submitted their lives to God's authority. But my audience here, I believe for the most part, has made that declaration. You want to submit to God's will in everything. And that should include His institution of marriage. The Hebrew writer says, he says, let marriage be held in honor among all. So while we might not be surprised to look out and see how man has made a mockery of God's institution of marriage, we also don't need to be so quick in judging others because I wonder sometimes, there are also some ways that maybe we have a tendency to do the same thing, but maybe just in different ways. I want to discuss this morning some things that the Bible teaches about marriage, but I want to mention them from that perspective of making sure that we're honoring God's institution of marriage. Because first and foremost, we want to glorify God in our marriages. However, I also believe, and hopefully this will be a thing that you see in my lesson, if a couple, if they submit to God's authority on the topic of marriage, it's going to be enjoyable. It's going to be mutually beneficial. It's going to be a blessing. Hopefully we see that this morning. So first, I had you turn to Genesis chapter 2, because I want us to review some points about God's design for marriage. And I realize that Brother Joey did a good job on this last week, but I want to go through this as well. And let's also ask the question, well, why is it important for us to honor God's design in marriage? Why is it important for us to submit to God's authority in all things? He's our creator. He's the creator of all things that are good. And as Joey showed us last week, marriage is no exception, because he's the one that designed it. At the end of Genesis chapter 1, you remember that God, he looked over his creation. And you remember he saw that it was very good. That's what he said. But then there's a contrast later on in chapter 2 and verse 18. When he put man in the garden, God says, it is not good that the man should be alone. God created all these creatures, and he had Adam name all of them. And I can't help but wonder, did God put Adam in that situation so that Adam, he would look around at all of creation and he would realize that as far as creation of his own nature, he was alone. There's something missing. God said in chapter 2, verse 18, says, I will make him a helper fit for him. By the way, Brother Joey, the biggest difference, I think, between the young man's point of view of marriage and the middle-aged point of view is that my wife gets to help me with my lesson. I'll give you a hint as to which part she helped me with this week. I want you to help me clarify something about God created woman here as a helper. I want to clarify this because with our English term helper, there's sometimes this misunderstanding that woman was created as kind of a sidekick, kind of a second tier, like an assistant. But that core idea of that Hebrew word ezer, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, ezer, it is an assistance rendered at a point of real need. I also want you to realize that this same word in the Bible is sometimes used of God's help for men. So I say that to say, don't misunderstand this term as God saying that woman is somehow inferior to me. One author, I like this, he said that really an, quote, ideal partner, it really seems to convey the idea best. God's creation is intentional. Clearly, man and woman, they were designed to be the perfect complement to one another. Adam said when he saw Eve, he says, this is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And then at the end of the chapter, it says this, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Then the man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed. Jesus also, of course, reiterates this design and his intention for marriage in Matthew chapter 19, where he answers, he says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And it said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So the basics are this. Marriage is designed to be between a man and a woman. Marriage constitutes a new family, a very unique bond. But then also, he tells us in verse 16, God intends for marriage to be for life. Now we already know that man doesn't always honor God's institution of marriage, but we're God's people. We need to honor God's design for marriage even when the world doesn't. So those are the basics. Let's take it a step further now. Genesis chapter 2. By the way, you might be turning to Ephesians chapter 5. And if you want to go ahead, you might also put your finger in 1 Peter chapter 3. But we're going to flip back and forth between those two a couple of times. But in Genesis chapter 2, we saw God's initial institution and design for marriage. But I want us to talk also about the roles that God assigned within marriage. As we said, even when God created man and woman, it was clear that there was a complementary design between the two. We saw man and woman come together to become one flesh. And just as the body is often paralleled in the Bible with God's design for the church, we understand that within the body, there are different elements of the body, different parts of the body, And while they're all necessary and important, they have different functions. They have different roles. The same is true in marriage. So first let's talk about the role of a wife. Start with me in Ephesians chapter 5. Let's look at verse 22. He says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." So the role of a wife, Paul says here, is to be in submission to her husband. I have to turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, because in 1 Peter 3, Peter indicates that this order is perhaps even the case in a marriage that's between a Christian and a non-Christian. Because he says in 1 Peter 3 and verse 1, he says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without it by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct." So the wife's pattern for submission is compared to the way that the church submits to Christ. And I fully realize this morning, some don't like that teaching. I think it's a natural human reaction. The idea of being in submission is usually completely negative. Yeah, this is God's design for the home. And later on we're going to mention why this isn't a bad thing. Paul goes on, if you go back to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 now in verse 25. Paul's going to go on and instruct the husbands. He says, "Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church, and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body." So wives are told to submit to their husbands. Husbands are told to love their wives. Now, is this saying that wives are told to submit but not love? No, that's not what he's saying. Paul actually told Titus to tell the older women to train the younger women to love their husbands and their children. That's not what he's saying. But I think the point that Paul is making here, as he's focusing on the role of the husband, is that husbands have a tough task ahead of them. Husbands, you love your wives. And your pattern. So Joel's already made the point clear this morning. That's pretty tough. That's a high level. That's a high standard. The pattern is Christ, because of his love, laid down his life for the church. In other words, the husband is called to put his wife ahead of himself. Peter also writes about husbands back over in 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7. He says, "Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered." Husbands are to love their wives in a sacrificial way. But Peter also says that they're to honor their wives. I don't want you to misunderstand what he's saying here when he says, honor her as the weaker vessel. Most commentators that I've read seem to agree that there's at least some awareness here of the general physical differences between men and women. But I don't think that that's all that Peter has in mind. Because a weaker vessel, I think sometimes we have this misconception that a weaker vessel means less. But a weaker vessel certainly doesn't mean lesser value in any sense. Because here's how I think of it. On one hand, you have this good quality cooking pan, right? And some of those, if you get a good quality one, it's pretty costly. It's also really valuable when you're hungry and you want to cook something. Then you have fine china. It's very carefully formed from very delicate materials. It's usually is a lot more beautiful than the pot. It's very costly as well. Both of these vessels, they're of value, are they not? But you don't handle them the same way, do you? When Peter says that husbands are to honor their wives as the weaker vessel, he's saying you don't need to treat them like you would a man. You understand her value. You understand that she needs to be protected. She needs to be handled with understanding and care. They are heirs with you of the grace of life, he says. Brother, do not underestimate or underemphasize the role that God has given husbands. This is a responsibility. Sometimes I think we have this misconception, well, if he's the leader of the home, well, that's the place that I want to be. No, this is a responsibility. It requires humility. It requires unselfishness. Something that men aren't always good at. I thought I might get a man from the ladies there. Let me just share with you a few thoughts on these statements that we've just been saying. First, you cannot claim to be a Christian and believe in different roles in marriage than what is described in Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter chapter 3. You know, on one hand, the feminist movement has done a lot of damage and poisoned a lot of minds, even of Christians, into thinking that God's design is demeaning. But I want you to also understand, at the same time, men are by far not innocent either. You know, in my younger years, I can't help but regret falling short in this area because we have a tendency to focus on the wife's role of submission while completely neglecting what God's instructions for men are, and that they're to love their wives in a sacrificial, understanding, and caring way. We also have a tendency sometimes to look at these commands. We recognize what God says. We just read it, right? But then we justify ignoring them by saying, well, my spouse isn't obeying you. In other words, it's this classic, well, I'm not going to do what I'm supposed to do until they do what they're supposed to do. And yet I don't see anything in those passages that would suggest that our responsibility is dependent on them acting on it. But remember, we said in our introduction, if a couple, if they submit to God's authority on the topic of marriage, it's going to be enjoyable. It's going to be mutually beneficial. It will be a blessing. If the husband, if he's loving his wife like Christ, if he's honoring her as something of great value, if he's protecting her, if he's caring for her like Christ does the church, do you not think the wife will have an easier time doing her part? Let me ask you this question. Does the church resent submitting to Christ when Christ does all that he does for the church? Of course not. If the wife, if she submits to her husband, if she supports her husband, if she does her part, it's going to be much easier for the husband to do his part. Because remember, 1 Peter 3, it indicated for us that our behavior, it can influence. Yeah? Well, what happens so many times in relationships is we end up in this vicious cycle where both parties, they're holding out, waiting for the other to act right, and thus, no one ever does. Before I leave this point, though, I also realize there are sometimes situations where there is that innocent spouse. Regardless of how hard they try, their spouse isn't what they ought to be, and that's a hard situation. We need to have some grace and compassion for that. But what we're trying to illustrate is how wonderful a biblical marriage is when both parties are in submission to Christ. Thirdly, this morning, if we're honoring God's institution, we're going to be following what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 13 and verse 4. I read part of this earlier. Let's read the whole thing. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and the adultery. You know, the Bible warns in a variety of places against sexual immorality. And the temptation to be sexually immoral is often very intense, and it's a temptation that probably everyone on the planet will face at some point in time. However, God, of course, He created man and woman. He created that marriage relationship as we've seen, and of course, guess what? He's the one that created sexual intimacy as well. But His intention is clear. It is designed to be enjoyed within the marriage relationship. In fact, one of the very first things that God told Adam and Eve after He blessed them was He said what? Be fruitful and multiply. Remember, He said in Genesis 2 verse 34, they're to become one flesh. And while that phrase, one flesh, I think it's a little bit broader than just the physical union of a couple. I think if you were to cross-reference it with other passages, such as 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the physical is very obviously part of it. Paul also says in 1 Corinthians 7, he talks about how intimacy within marriage is helpful in guarding against sexual temptations. Spouses are told not to deprive one another unless they both agree. Again, it is part of God's intention for marriage. And brother, it is a good thing in that context. But there are also many ways that we can dishonor God's design for intimacy within marriage. There are several passages that warn strongly against sexual immorality or fornication, as some translations say. This is essentially any kind of sexual act that occurs outside of God's design, which is again to be within marriage. Because who did God say that He was going to judge in regards to dishonoring the marriage bed? Back in that passage we read in Hebrews 13, it mentions the sexually immoral. The sexually immoral are among those that will not inherit the kingdom of God. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 9. Again, as we recognize that God's design for sexual relationships was to be within marriage, seeking that type of relationship outside of God's design, it is immoral. It dishonors God's design for intimacy within marriage. The Hebrew writer also pointed us to adultery being a way that we dishonor God's intention for intimacy within marriage. According to Galatians 5, it's a work of the flesh. And when you consider the covenant of marriage, when you think about the vows that we traditionally take, this is obviously a sin that violates the commitments that were made within marriage. This is, of course, when someone goes outside the marriage relationship to fulfill their desire for sexual relationships. Now we know, I want you to hear me on this point. Adultery is not unforgivable. Adultery is a sin just like any other sin that can be forgiven by the blood of Christ. Marriages can survive adultery. It's difficult, but they can. They do. I know of couples personally that work to reconcile following adultery. Honestly, you would probably be surprised by some of them, because some of them are ones that I look up to. I want my marriage to be like they are today, because they're stronger today than they were before. But at the same time, don't discount the problems that adultery can cause with trust. The problems it can cause with intimacy. A lot of problems it can cause. I need you to understand that adultery, it needs to be avoided within marriage, because it can cause lasting impacts to a marriage. I want to create a separate item under the heading of emotional affairs. Sometimes within the marriage relationship, one or both spouses may develop relationships with people that are outside the marriage. And it often mimics the relationship that husbands and wives are supposed to have, just maybe not with the physical part yet. There's a lot of dangers here. And some would say, well, Kevin, technically the Bible only says that it's sexual immorality that's the problem. And to that I would say, at a minimum, you are playing with fire. Because when you start replacing that emotional relationship that you're to have with your spouse for someone else, that in itself is not good. But what does it do? It opens up the door for a great deal of temptation for other things as well. This is something we need to be guarding against. Guard against it in the workplace, at school. Brother, you've got to be careful on social media. There are some things that I just don't like about social media, and this is one of them. Also remember, a few years back, maybe some of y'all remember this, but our Vice President, Mike Pence, at the time, he got a lot of grief from the media for saying that he would not dine alone with a woman out of respect for his marriage. He got grief for that. And I'm not saying that should be a hard and fast rule. But I really appreciated his example that he set in regards to guarding his marriage against temptation. And I'm not suggesting that men and women should be friends. I'm not saying that you have to draw the same line. But if we are honoring God's institution for marriage, playing with fire, it seems to be enough. We could spend an entire lesson talking about the dangers of pornography. And I'll try and be brief and mindful of my audience this morning, but pornography is no doubt one of the silent killers of God's design for marriage. According to statistics, the temptation is even prevalent among Christians. It impacts men the most, but women are impacted as well. Addiction to pornography, it leads to a lot of problems that dishonors God's plan for intimacy within marriage. It leaves spouses sometimes feeling inadequate, betrayed, neglected. It can cause emotional separation between spouses. It contributes to infidelity. It can result in separation and divorce. It leads to secrets. It leads to lies between spouses. But brother, there ought not be anything between a husband and wife that requires a secret. Unless maybe you work on the arsenal. Even though the use of pornography is not the physical act of adultery, clearly lasciviousness is something that Jesus warns us. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." If we know that God's intention is for sex to be within marriage, replacing one's spouse with someone on a screen, it dishonors God's intention for intimacy within marriage. Brother, I believe the Scriptures will teach us that if husbands and wives, if they will honor God's intention for intimacy within marriage and avoid all those things that we talked about dishonors it, you're going to have a happier, much more enjoyable marriage as a result of that. Finally, this morning, I want to talk to you about honoring God's, and I've changed my heading here. It said originally, it says honoring God's plan for marriage. I wanted to specify honoring His entire plan for marriage. And a lot of this relates to our previous point, because part of God's plan for marriage, it talks about the roles of husbands and wives that we've already said. Part of His plan for marriage includes intimacy within marriage. But let's add to that just real quick. And we've already mentioned this earlier, but I want to pull this down from Romans chapter 7, which indicates that God's plan for marriage is to be joint. Wives are bound to their husbands as long as they live, and vice versa. And while this used to be the norm in our culture, this is becoming less and less the case. Marriage is regarded as something you can try out. If it doesn't work out, you get a divorce and try again. And the problem with this casual approach is that people aren't thinking too long and hard about who it is that they're marrying. And they end up in a situation that's going to impact the rest of their life. So to the young people, for those that aren't married and they want to be married someday, you need to realize the decision that you make is going to impact the rest of your life. I say that to say, young people, those that want to be married, marriage is a wonderful thing. But make sure it's to a person that's going to help you get to heaven. Not just to someone that you're attracted to. Although that doesn't matter. So we know that. You've probably heard that all your life. But I want you to also understand marriage is not just intended to be it for life. God's plan for marriage is that it ought to be something where both spouses benefit from it. I want you to think about several passages you've perhaps read. Proverbs 12 says an excellent wife is the crown of her husband. Proverbs 18 says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Proverbs chapter 31, it describes a good wife as more precious than jewels. Colossians 3, good husbands will benefit their wives by being kind and not harsh. Earlier we saw in 1 Peter chapter 3, good husbands will honor their wives. Ephesians 5, we saw that husbands, according to God's design, they love sacrificially. They protect, they care for their wives. So the point that I want to make abundantly clear this morning is that I think sometimes we make the mistake of emphasizing the longevity above the quality. And yet I want you to understand God's plan for there to be both. It's so common for us to point out and praise those that have been married for long periods of time, and that's a good thing. It's not wrong. That is part of God's plan for marriage. I want you to I'm telling you that's part of His plan for marriage. But let's not exalt God's plan for marriage to be lifelong and neglect the importance of making marriage what God desires for it to be. God's plan for marriage based on the Scriptures is not meant to be a lifelong commitment of misery and abuse. It's meant to be a lifelong commitment of two people that they put the other above themselves and they benefit from it. Let's not fall into this trap of looking at the lifelong commitment of marriage and saying, hey, I got them. I got the ring on there. I got them trapped. They can't get out. Because if we do that, we'll take each other for granted. And then God's plan for marriage can be a lesson. It's still better. Let's make sure that we're honoring God's whole plan for marriage, not just parts of it. As we close this morning, God's institution of marriage is something that needs to be honored by all, especially His people. There's this great temptation for us to want to mold our opinions according to our culture. However, for Christians, we ought to honor those things that God has told us to honor. I want you to hear me on this. Marriage, it is a blessing from God. I think Joey said something similar to that last week. Marriage is a wonderful blessing from God, but only when it's honoring His design. For those that are married, let's all work towards having marriages that are in accordance with God's will. And for those that may get married one day, let me encourage you. You purpose in your heart. If you haven't already, purpose in your heart right now. You're going to submit to God's will for marriage. I want you to look for someone with that same goals for that. Before we close this morning, I want to mention to you that there is a parallel that is made in the Scriptures between Christ's relationship with the church and the marriage. And He offers you an opportunity to be in a covenant relationship with Him. My question to you this morning, do you have a relationship with Christ? Have you submitted your life to Him? And we already alluded to this. Now that idea of submission, it's really scary when you're talking about submitting to an imperfect person. But with Christ, there's peace, there's security, there's joy, there's blessings for those with you. Christ is the Savior of the church. You're never going to regret having a relationship with Him. Just think about these things as we stand.